Welcome, everybody. I'm so happy that you're here with me tonight. My name is Ann Dolin, and I'm your host this evening. Tonight, we're talking about the secrets to making college applications stand out. And the good news is that I have Kristin Landis with me tonight, a former UVA admissions evaluator, to talk to us about how we can make those applications stand out. I'm going to introduce her in a second. For the last 24 years, my tutors, executive function coaches, and college counselors have been helping kids to do better in school and to get into the colleges of their choice. So before we get started this evening, I'd love to know, what grade is your student in? When will your child or your kids graduate from high school? You're going to see a poll pop up in just a second, and take a moment to let us know what year your child will graduate from high school. Thank you so much. It looks like we have lots of rising seniors and followed by rising juniors. So 40, it looks like, I think we're done. 45% of parents have a rising senior. 33% have a rising junior, followed by 12% with rising sophomores, and then students younger. Awesome. That's super helpful so that we can customize the program this evening. All right. Well, I'm glad you're here. And if you have a younger child who's not even ready for the college application process yet, you've come to the right place, because you can't start too early in knowing all of these things that we'll share with you this evening. So first, I wanted you to meet Kristin Landis. Kristin, welcome. I'm so glad you're here with us tonight.
Thanks for having me, Ann.
So let me tell you about Kristin's experience at University of Virginia. She worked there for 11 years, evaluating kids' applications. In fact, she evaluated over 10,000 applications from in-state, out-of-state candidates, and those, and also international candidates. Kristin is now a college consultant with us, and she works with families. In fact, she works with kids starting in 8th grade all the way to rising seniors. And she has a Bachelor of Science from University of Richmond, and she actually has a law degree from Emory University School of Law in Atlanta. So Kristin, I'm super excited to have you with us tonight. Let's start with the big question and that is, what are the top elements that you really look for as an evaluator when thinking, are kids going to get into the school or not?
Sure. I mean, first and foremost is probably the most obvious. It's your academics, and that's consisting of the courses that your student has taken, specifically also the program rigor that they've taken and the grades, how they've performed in those classes. That will trump everything initially, but there are other components of the application as well that play an important part. Testing, we all know that a lot of schools have gone to test optional with the pandemic, and some are staying that way. So testing can play a part if you indeed submit your scores. But lastly, the thing that I want to talk to you about the most is the human insight component. That's what I call it. It gets comprised of your recommendations, your extracurriculars, what you're doing outside of the classroom, as well as your essays. And this is becoming increasingly more important because colleges are seeing more and more applications. The Common App issued a statistics that applications in 2021 were up 22%. So it's really important for the student to set themselves apart from their peers. And doing that is a good way to do that is through the human insight component. It's an opportunity for you to craft a narrative of why your student stands out.
Why are applications up now more than ever before?
I think that there's a number of reasons. One is that with the pandemic and the going to the test optional, a lot of students felt like they could cast a wider net and apply to schools that they wouldn't have thought they could get into before. And so they've applied to more schools. I think another reason is that with the pandemic and going virtual, colleges have gotten really, really proficient at putting things online. There are virtual tours. There's a lot more information out on the internet for students. And so students are learning more and more about schools without actually having to go and visit them. Not everyone can go visit every college. And so kids are applying to more schools because of that.
Makes sense. You mentioned rigor and you mentioned the quality of your classes and course selection. How important is course selection for high schoolers?
It's a really important component of the application. Colleges, evaluators want to see that a student has challenged themselves, that they've taken academic risks. They want to see 4 years of the core classes, which are math, English, science, history, and lastly, foreign language. Especially if you're applying to highly competitive schools, they want to see 4 years of a foreign language. 4 years of one language is optimal, but 2 and 2 is fine as well. Another thing about course selections that's important is it also gives a little bit of insight into what the student is passionate about or interested in. You can see that through the coursework, specifically through your electives. That's a great opportunity to kind of show what you're interested in, but also in just your core classes. For an example, so let's take a student who's really interested in architecture. If they took in some of their electives some design classes, a CAD class, that shows that interest. Or if a student is really interested in engineering or robotics, you want to see that they in their core classes have taken the most rigorous math they can, whether that takes them through BC calculus, multivariable calculus, or linear algebra. Those are some of the courses that you want to see in the core classes if you're interested in something like engineering. So the other thing is, though, that there's a delicate balance between showing interest in a specific area and also being too linear or myopic. And an example of that would be, I'm never more excited than when I see an engineering student who has a ton of STEM classes, but then they went and they took AP art history, or they took a music theory class. So it's a delicate balance between showing that interest, but also being somewhat well-rounded.
Kristin, one question we get all the time from parents is, how many AP or IB classes should my student take in high school?
Yeah, I mean, I get that question a lot as well, Anne. And there's no hard and fast rule. I mean, a lot of that is going to be specific to your school. If the student's high school only offers a couple APs, or maybe they don't offer any APs, they only offer dual enrollment, or if there's an IB program. So it's whatever your specific high school offers, taking the most rigorous classes that you can, to which you can perform well in. So there's no real hard and fast number.
That kind of brings us to the next question. And this is something that isn't talked about very often, but it's incredibly important, especially coming from Northern Virginia or a school district that is fairly competitive. How do colleges use high school profiles to compare students?
The high school profile is very, very important. For us evaluators, it's called the SSR, or the Secondary School Report. And almost every single high school has one. Parents, students, you can go to your high school website, usually under the college consulting part, there'll be the school profile, they usually call it. You can click on that and you can see what it looks like. And it varies from school to school what kind of information they provide on that profile. But when I opened an application, when I was at UVA, the first thing I would do was look at the high school profile to see what kind of courses does the school offer? How do they weight them in the GPA? So let's say that they offer AP classes and they gave that a 5.0, where they give an honors class a 4.0. So that's very, very important when you're evaluating a program, to see what the school offers. So that's one thing. Some schools offer actually class rankings. They'll say that, this GPA to this GPA is in the first decile, or they'll say this is the highest GPA or the lowest GPA in the class, or they'll offer the median test scores. So all those things are really important when the evaluator is trying to acclimate to what the school offers, because that's the only way they can evaluate a student, is by what's offered in their environment. So why is that important? It's really, really important for students to make the most out of what their school has to offer and leverage upon it. And that's why it's so important to craft that narrative.
So it sounds like it's less important. I know parents always go to these websites like College Data and they'll look at, oh, what does it take to get into this school or that school? But really, although that's important, it's really more important when it comes down to who's applying from your school.
Very
Can you
much
talk a
so.
little bit about that?
Yeah, there's really no way to get around that. I mean, your student is going to be compared to those students sitting next to them. That's just how it's done in college admissions. And that's why it's so important to craft that narrative to try to set your student apart from the person sitting next to them.
So let's talk a little bit about the narrative, because you've mentioned that a few times. What is that and why is it important?
I know, I'm sure people are tired of hearing me keep saying the word narrative, but it really is an important part of the college application and admissions process. So when I reviewed a student's application, I'm looking at that application and seeing the story that they're telling me, and I'm asking myself these questions. What can this student contribute and enhance the environment of my college, both in and out of the classroom? And can my college provide this student with the best opportunities for personal and academic growth? And the answers to those questions are done through what we call a narrative. And that's making a common theme or thread throughout the application. And you can see that insight in the course selection and what the student does outside of the classroom, in their recommendations, and in what they highlight in their essays. So an example of this would be, let's say a student has an interest in marine biology. So they take an aquaculture class at their high school. If that's not offered, maybe they take an online course. Maybe they went and got their scuba certification, and then maybe they volunteer at a conservation center in their town. That's kind of just showing a common thread. Or let's say you have a student who's really entrepreneurial and that they want to go into business. They took an entrepreneurial class at school, or they developed their own business, or they have a paper route or something of that nature. So it's making a thread through all the things, through your courses, through your essays, and then hopefully your recommendations will also highlight those things as well.
Thank you, Kristin. Now, since you're no longer at UVA and now you're helping our students, tell us a little bit about how you help your students that kind of feel like they're average. They kind of feel like there's nothing unique about them. How do you pull that narrative out of kids?
Sure. There is absolutely something unique about every single kid, no question. And it's daunting to think, oh, well, I'm only 15. I'm not really passionate about anything yet. Well, I'm in my 50s and I still don't know what I want to do. So it's sitting with the student and asking questions like, what do you like to do in your free time? What makes you happy? Just in asking those kind of general questions, and the student starts saying, oh, I really love to read. And you start talking about some of their favorite books, or they say, I'm really interested in animals. I love animals. You can take those interests and help them. And that's why it's so important to start early if you can with students, and help them kind of set up, well, let's think about doing some things outside of the classroom in that, or taking a course in that. Or that's something we're definitely going to highlight in your essay, because that's really at your core. That makes you you. And so that's how you do it.
Awesome. I love that, Kristin. I love that there's something unique about every student,
Absolutely.
even though they may not think so in the moment. So if you are interested in working with Kristin or any other of our other college consultants, we would love to help you. And in fact, Erin Ebert is our college consulting program director, and Erin is amazing. She's worked with me for almost 12 years now in many different capacities, but she's an expert at helping parents navigate the college process. So if you would like some more information on how we can help you, I'll talk about it a little bit later, or you just want to talk to her about your kids, she would love to help. And you can reach out to her by scheduling a call, a 20-minute consultation, and you can just take your phone, open up the camera, point it to the QR code, and that will bring you to her calendar to schedule a time to talk. You can also give her a call at 703-934-8282, or visit our website, ectutoring.com. And on our website, there's a drop-down tab that says College Consulting, and that has all the information on our programs. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit. We talked about developing the narrative, but let's talk about leadership and experiences outside of the classroom. especially when some kids will say, I'm kind of shy, I'm not really a leader. Tell us a little bit about this element of leadership and why working outside the classroom is important these days.
Sure, absolutely. I think a lot of people, that buzzword of leadership, I need to be, president of the student body or captain of the lacrosse team or the drum major. Yes, those are all wonderful, fantastic leadership opportunities. And if your child is someone who does those things, fantastic, let's highlight it. But there's leadership found in many, many, many different ways. There's subtle leadership, there's silent leaders, and it's just a matter of working with a student, and they may not even realize it, that they're already operating as a leader. If they have a job, if they help take care of their siblings, if they drive their brother to their afternoon activities, if they're helping take care of a grandparent, those are all forms of leadership. If they've made a major contribution in a project in the classroom, or if they've helped tutor someone, those are all forms of leadership, and those can all be highlighted. The other thing on the flip side, when we talk about experiences, obviously positive experiences that students have had, you want to highlight that, but also, students, even 15, 16, 17-year-olds have gone through tremendous challenges. And it's important to highlight those things as well, because that makes them who they are. And the more authenticity you can bring to the application, the better. I think I've told you before, Anne, that there's been many nights when I was reading applications where I sat and was sobbing, because children have gone through many, many different things. And if I see a student who has had a challenge or an obstacle, and they've shown perseverance or maturity, I mean, that's something really important and should be highlighted and celebrated. So as much as we're interested in those students who are president of the class and captain of the football team, we also are interested in those students who are introverts and who have struggled and persevered.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Kristin. I want to shift gears for just a second and answer a few questions that I see in the chat. And Mandy wants to know, what if a student isn't sure what they want to major in? They know they're not interested in a STEM field. And if that's the case, and in her child's case, can the student get away with not taking AP Calculus, AP Chemistry, AP Physics? If schools want them to take the hardest courses offered at their school, and other kids around them are applying to these competitive colleges, how can they realistically not take those high-level AP courses, even if they don't want to do STEM? So,
I mean, absolutely. I went to law school because I found math super hard. So I totally and absolutely get that. And as long as, if your student doesn't want to go into a STEM field, then they shouldn't have to take AP Chemistry. That's fine. But then they should have that rigor in some other part of their program. Let's say they love English. So taking AP English Literature, or they really are a history buff, or they find history interesting, taking an AP government class or an AP US history. So, I mean, the rigor has to be there somewhere for these highly competitive schools. But it doesn't necessarily have to, you don't have to take AP Calculus in order to get into a great school if you're not going that STEM route.
Got it. Thank you, Kristin. Mm-hmm. Deborah asked if there are really schools that require 4 years of a foreign language.
So requires is the word that you're using. I will say at highly competitive schools, they like to see 4 years of a foreign language. And if you're not going to take 4 years of a foreign language, then hopefully the program is super strong in other areas. Thank you for that.
Is it true that more B's than A's in AP or IB classes is frowned upon?
I guess the answer would be, how many B's are we talking about? Are we talking about just a couple of B's, 1 B? If we're talking about 5 B's, that's a different story. I mean, obviously you want a 1 or 2 or B's in an AP class, or 3 B's, that's fine depending on the school that you're applying to. But you definitely want to see those higher level rigorous courses.
Thanks for that, Kristin. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about testing. Can a good score help you even in this test optional environment?
Absolutely. I talked about this at the beginning. Of course, a good test score can help you. The operative word is good. good test score at one school may not be a good test score at another school. So it's really, really important that you research the schools that your child is applying to and see what those median and upper range SAT and ACT scores are. And if your student's score falls up in those ranges, absolutely submit it. If it doesn't, then I wouldn't submit it, because once you've submitted the score, now it's going to be evaluated. So it's really important that you look and see which schools you're applying to and what they consider a good score.
Thanks, Kristin. And speaking of scores, as Kristin mentioned, a good score can help. And the first step in figuring out how you're going to test is to take a practice test. And we offer these on most Saturdays. And here are our upcoming tests for the ACT and the SAT. And so a mock test is basically a retired test that kids can take. They can roll out of bed, take these virtually with a live proctor, and they're scored. And these scores are comparable to what they would get sitting for the real test. And this way, this is your data. You own this data. Nobody else sees it but you. And then with that information, if you take a practice SAT and a practice ACT, we can put it in a concordance table for you and tell you which test your child is strongest in. About a third of kids are clearly stronger if their natural inclination is towards one test. But for about 2/3 of kids, it's kind of a toss-up. And we often ask the kids, which test did you feel most comfortable with? And the reason that's helpful is because you don't need to spend a ton of time preparing for both tests. Every school in America accepts both tests and they don't have a preference. So if you're scoring better on the ACT or you like the ACT better, for example, you should prepare and take just that test. It saves you time. It saves you money if you decide to hire a tutor to help you. And it really helps you to focus on that one test. And then, as Kristin mentioned, with your score, usually kids take the test 2 or 3 times. Your best score may be submitted to a school that maybe is in your mid-range, or maybe they're your safety school, but you may not submit that score to maybe one of your top schools. So we will help you, or Kristin will help you determine a testing strategy, when your child should take the test, how many times your child should take the test, based on their course selection and based on their schedule, how busy they are, and then whether to submit those scores to various colleges on your list. So I hope that is helpful when it comes to testing. All right, so let's talk recommendation letters, Kristin. Tell us a little bit about why recommendation letters are important and the different kinds of recommendation letters, for example, teachers versus counselors.
Sure, absolutely. As I said when we started our conversation, recommendation letters are important in that they're part of that human insight component of the application. It helps show, what there is about the student, what makes them tick, what they're passionate about, what they're interested in, what kind of learner they are. And so the different recommendations, all colleges require a guidance counselor recommendation. And I don't want parents to get nervous about guidance counselor recommendations, because some people, their student goes to a very, very large high school and the guidance counselor may have 100 students in their caseload. And college evaluators know that. So when I get an application and the guidance counselor recommendation is either just the checks on the Common App, or they don't even submit a recommendation, I've never, and I don't know anyone who's penalized a student for that reason. And there are a lot of times guidance counselor recommendations are more rote. If you're reading a bunch of applications from the same school and they have the same guidance counselor, sometimes you'll see very similar recommendations. That's fine, not penalizing the student in any form. So that's one of the reasons that teacher recommendations are really, really important, because the teacher has gotten to know the student in the classroom, knows what kind of learner they are, sees how they engage in the classroom. And so those are very important. And my recommendations to students about getting teacher recommendations is to start early. A lot of schools, the teachers, especially those teachers that are favorites, only write a certain number of recommendations. And when students come, it's on a first come, first serve basis. They start filling, the teacher's only going to write 30 recommendations that summer. That's all they can do. So when those 30 slots are filled, then the student has to go ask someone else for a recommendation. So I suggest students go to teachers early, sometime towards the end of their junior year, if possible, to ask teachers for recommendations. The other thing, try to make it easy for the teachers. Provide them with as much information about your student as possible. Give them a resume. For the students I work with, I give them a little questionnaire that asks questions that gives a little bit of insight into the student, and I have them give that to the teacher as well. So as much information you can give to the teacher as they write your recommendation, the better. Always follow up with a thank you to the teacher, because it is a lot of work for teachers. So we definitely want to be appreciative of them. And then on the other hand, there are other kinds of recommendations you can have as well. Think outside of the box. Maybe your student is an athlete and they have a coach recommendation, or they volunteer somewhere. The leader of the volunteer organization could write them a recommendation. So definitely think an employer is also a great recommendation. So sometimes schools they'll either require 1 or 2 teacher recommendations, but sometimes they also give you the option to submit another recommendation. And if your student does have someone that they're close to, maybe I've had a student before, I remember he was really close to a neighbor, an elderly neighbor, and he helped that neighbor a tremendous amount and sat with him a lot. And that elderly neighbor wrote a recommendation, and it touched my heart. And I still remember that recommendation to this day. So that's how recommendations can really make the student come alive, and they're important in that way.
Thank you for that, Kristin. I love the story about the neighbor and that it stood out to you. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of applications in terms of applying to schools in-state, out-of-state. Why does that matter? Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. If a student is going to apply to an in-state university, this is where it really comes into play, because most states have a certain number or a mandate of percentage of in-state students that they have to accept. At the University of Virginia, 2/3 of the students have to be Virginia residents. For Virginia Tech and for UNC, 80% of the students roughly are in-state residents. So what does that mean? How does that translate? That means that if you're an in-state student to that state university, you have a higher percentage chance of getting into that university. For UVA, for example, 28% acceptance rate for in-state students, a 15% acceptance rate for out-of-state students. A place like William & Mary, 48% acceptance in-state, 32% out of state. UNC, this is a huge difference, 41% in-state acceptance and a 13% out of state. And lastly, because there's another one that just shows a huge gamut, is Georgia Tech, 40% in-state acceptance and a 17% out of state acceptance. So we really, when you research your schools, if you are applying to in-state schools, look and see their acceptance rate for in and out of state applicants, especially if you're applying to state schools as an out of state applicant, you want to look at those things. And then there's another thing I want to just address. Demographics in general are important. Colleges love to show that map or show the statistics that they have students from every single state in the country. So if you are a Virginia resident and you're applying to a school in Montana or Washington State, that may be very interesting to that university because you are coming from an interesting demographic.
That's a great point, Kristin. Let's talk a little bit about recruited athletes and kids that want to play sports in school. How can a recruited athlete navigate the application process?
Yeah, student athletes, it's a very different process and it's mandated by the NCAA rules. They're very, very strict and they're very specific by sport and also by whether you want to go Division I, Division II, or Division III. For example, in Division I, most sports, the coaches can't contact the student until after June 15th of their sophomore year. But that changes. Baseball is different, football is different. For Division III, coaches can't contact the student until after June 15th of completing their junior year. but unofficial visits are acceptable anytime. So my point is, it's very, very specific in terms of the type of contact a coach can have with a student, when they can have that contact, and that is indicative of which division they want to play in, and also what sport. So what can an athlete do? I recommend, I was a recruited swimmer at University of Richmond. I went directly to the coach. I contacted the coach. I sent them an email. If your student plays a sport like swimming or is in track and they have a very definitive time for an event, I would send them the events that you do, the times that you for your events. If they're in a team sport, you can have send them your stats, like how many goals you've made accomplished, how many yardage, how fast you run in a mile for yardage. And then you can also submit a highlight video. I would provide them with your academic information and also why you're interested in their program specifically. Another great idea is if your student is really interested in playing a sport at a specific school, go to their summer camp. The coaches are usually running those summer camps. It's a revenue generating thing for coaches, and they run those summer camps. If your student isn't an athlete, that's fine too. There are lots of things for non-athletes. There are very talented musicians out there, artists. Contact the chair of the department of the music department or of the art department. You can submit a portfolio or an audition tape to them. It's another way to just kind of set yourself apart.
And there's so much to know about the process. Thank
is.
you for shedding light on it.
Sure.
And if you're feeling overwhelmed, we can help. And that's what we're here for. And I hope this evening was helpful for you. We're going to get to questions in just a second. But I want to share with you our programs and how we help students. So we have specific programs for younger students. And these are kids that are finishing up 8th and 9th grade. They're rising 9th and 10th graders right now. And we help these students with course selection, planning their summer, crafting that narrative, as Kristin was mentioning, and understanding the process. And this is a limited amount of time, but we'll work with students in getting started through the process and making sure that they have everything set up. For our kids that are rising 11th and 12th graders, we also help them with course selection, planning their summers, and crafting their narrative, and also their applications. For seniors, we have a senior express package. So this is for students that are going into their senior year right now. It's just 10 hours. It's only for seniors. We help them with their college list, refining their college list, which I'll talk about in a second. We help them to complete their applications, which means finalize their college resume, make sure that they've submitted their recommendations, help with their essay ideas, make sure they're technically correct, help with editing, and make sure that they submit their applications on time, which is no easy task because there's a lot to do with applications, much more than when we were students. So I want to touch on the idea of the college list, which we talked about, Kristin, in our last webinar, but not so much this time around. And what I've found, because of the pandemic and kids applying to more schools than ever before, is that students come to us with really unbalanced lists. So it used to be before they'd have some reach schools, some target schools, some safety schools. What I've noticed in the last year is that they're out of whack in terms of way too many reach schools. Have you seen the same thing with your students, and how can parents have, or how can kids have, a balanced list?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've definitely seen that. That's why I think doing the legwork, doing the homework ahead of time is really important. Researching schools, looking at their admissions rates, managing your own expectations, and looking at, your GPA, your scores versus what's the acceptance rates at those schools are. Obviously, you have that human insight component that plays a factor, but this gives you somewhat of a ballpark. But one thing I want to just say to everyone, because I know it's really hard. This is a really difficult process, and it's an anxiety producing process. So one thing, try not to listen to the noise. There's a lot of misinformation out there. even from guidance counselor. I was working with a parent just the other day, and she told me some of the things that the guidance counselor had said, and I was like, that's absolutely not correct. And so try not to listen to the noise, and also manage yours and your students' expectations. And lastly, there is a college for everyone. There absolutely is. And the experience of college is what the student makes of it. And so I think that takes up some of the pressure if you know that there is a college there for your student, and they can be successful anywhere. It's what they do with that experience. And finally, where you go to college doesn't define how happy you're going to be in life or how successful you're going to be in life. And I think if people could try to keep that in their minds, it takes a little bit of the pressure off this whole experience.
Yes, that's absolutely true, Kristin. So thank you for that. And thank
Sure.
you for joining us tonight and shedding light on the process with all of our families. We're going to go to questions in just a moment, but I wanted to remind you of our next webinar, which I'm super excited about, and it's on July 12th at 7 o'clock. And it's called How to College, Building Critical Adulting Skills in High School. And it's not about getting into college, it's about things that your child can do while they're in high school to prepare them for living independently in college. And our guest that evening is Dr. Andrea Brenner, and she's fabulous. Her book, How to College, is amazing. And she also has a deck of cards called Talking College. It's a card game, and it just gets the dialogue going in families about preparing for college. So I hope that you will join us. You can find that information on our website, which is ectutoring.com/webinar-series. All right, so we're going to go to questions in just a moment. And I wanted to let you know that after our Q&A, there will be a survey that pops up on your screen. And if you would be so kind to take that survey, that would be super helpful for us to know how we can improve for next time. So thank you. And if you want help with your child, you just want to talk about your situation, or you'd like information on how we can help, scan the QR code, and that will take you to Erin Ebert's calendar. And you can find general information on our website, which is ectutoring.com. All right, so let's take a look at questions. Kristin, we had a ton of questions about I know we talked about this earlier, but about foreign language. And it seems like parents are a little bit confused about, what constitutes a foreign language. So if they take a foreign language in 7th grade or 8th grade, and it is a high school credit, so they take 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, or 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, is that 4 years, and is that okay?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you get through, yes, the answer to the short answer, yes, that's okay. Because that you're taking Spanish 1 in 7th, 8th, you're taking Spanish 2 in 9th, you're taking Spanish 3 in 10th. You definitely want to get through the 3, 4, and AP is fantastic if you can do it. And I mean, I think that some schools do like to see the total 4 years in high school. If your child, if that's just not their thing and they're struggling and they don't want to do it, then I mean, you need to supplement it with a rigorous course somewhere else. That would be my answer.
Okay, thank you for that. Somebody else asked, when should students take practice tests? And generally, kids take practice tests to determine their testing strength the spring of their sophomore year, but usually like the summer right now for rising juniors, the summer before their junior year or the fall of their junior year. And then kids take the actual SAT or ACT usually the fall of their junior year, which is a little bit early, but definitely the spring of their junior year. And in fact, data tells us that kids score best. They have their highest score in the spring of their junior year. And that's really for 3 reasons. One is they've been in class longer. The second is they're more mature. And the third is they just have more time under their belt to prepare. So even if we've seen this big trend in the last 5 years, take the test early and often. And I don't necessarily subscribe to just, front loading it and taking it super early in the fall of your junior year, unless you're ready. If you want to do that, I would say also take it in the spring of the junior year. And now that the SAT and ACT have added summer tests, Many of our students take the test the summer before their junior year or senior year, and then again in the fall of their senior year. So you can still take the October SAT and still apply early decision or early action by November 1st and be just fine. All right. Another parent asked, Robin asked, how does somebody outside the school system, like an employer, write a letter of recommendation? Do they submit it through Naviance?
So that you can through the Common App, you can also send a invitation and that person can download it into the Common App. So that's a way that can be done.
Okay. On average, about how long does a college admissions officer or evaluator spend reviewing a student's application?
So there's no hard and fast rule. I take as long as it takes. If a student has poured, they've done 4 years of hard work, they've poured their soul into their application, I've always felt it was an honor to read that application, and I was going to spend as much time as was needed on that application.
Thank you. Is it more difficult to get into UVA and Virginia Tech if you're a resident from Northern Virginia versus, say, Southern Virginia, other parts of Virginia?
I mean, I don't think there's a hard and fast answer to that. What I can say is that you are compared to your peers. And so if there are more students applying from one high school than from another high school, that's more competition. But then again, also there are high schools that are more rigorous than other high schools. And so the university will dig deeper into a class than they would maybe from another high school.
That's helpful. Thank you. Do you have to put your ethnicity on your application?
You
Kathleen
do not.
wants to know.
You do not have to do that.
Great. Out of state, do schools take into consideration DC students? How does it work if you are from DC?
The District of Columbia is its own entity, so you are from the District of Columbia.
Kathleen wants to know about the SAT versus ACT. Did you have a perception when you evaluated scores? Did you ever have a preference of one test rather than the other one?
Absolutely not. And in fact, sometimes you would see like kids in the Midwest tend to take the ACT. Kids on the East Coast seems to in certain areas take the SAT more. So sometimes you'll see a regional preference, but the evaluators have absolutely no preference.
Thank you. Do clubs matter? How can you enrich a student's resume through clubs?
I mean, I would say clubs matter, but just doing something outside of school matters, whether that be a club or a job or a hobby that a student is like really, really interested in. Let's say someone loves crochet and spends a significant amount of time at crochet and sells their stuff on Etsy, so clubs per se, I would say it's not that, it's doing something outside of the classroom that's important.
What's a typical essay question that students can expect?
Well, you can go onto the Common App website, and they already have posted the 6 essays that you can choose from, that your student, that's their major essay, which is 600 words. So you can see those topics. And then their schools have supplemental essays. In our last webinar, we talked quite a bit about supplemental essays, and those vary from school to school. Some of them ask, something about like, what's your favorite book? Some of them that I'm seeing more often than not now is, why are you picking this university? What is it about our university that makes you want to come here?
Marie asks, how important is it to determine what major you select on your application? For example, if you know it's easier to get into one major and harder in another, should you apply to the program with the easier major and then transfer? We talked about this a lot in the last webinar. Can you touch on that?
Sure, we did. And so if you're applying to the College of Arts and Sciences, in which there's, could be 30 different majors, which one you pick in that college is not necessarily important. Where picking your area of study is important is when you have to apply to specific colleges in a university. At UVA, there's the Curry School for Kinesiology, there's the engineering school, there's the School of Architecture, and there's the School of Nursing. If you're interested in any of those specific areas, then you have to apply to that specific school. And it's very important that you research the universities that you're applying to and see how difficult it is to transfer, because at some schools, let's say you apply to the College of Arts and Sciences thinking it's easier to get into, but you really want to be in the engineering school, it may be impossible to transfer to the engineering school. So you really need to find that out before you apply to the university, and how, if you're going to try to play that off.
How can my student stand out how can my student on the spectrum stand out in the area? I'm not sure what this parent is asking, but basically the student, I think, doesn't really want to volunteer or have a job right now, and AP classes are too much. This is a student on the autism spectrum. How can they still stand out if they're not doing much out of school and they're nervous about taking really rigorous classes?
Sure. I mean, I think if a student is on the spectrum and they feel comfortable talking about that, that is something that truly defines them and is something that interesting that I'd like to hear about. So they could write about that. They can write about that experience for themselves and what kind of challenges that has presented for them. It's really trying to be as authentic as possible. And universities don't want to fill their whole class with, all extroverts, all people who are in a million different clubs. They want interesting people, and someone who's on the spectrum can bring a tremendous amount to a classroom and outside of a classroom. So if they could talk about that, and I would love to read that essay.
It kind of lends itself to the next question from Karen. She says, COVID has created some mental health challenges for students. How should students address this issue if they've had challenges?
Absolutely. I can't tell you how many applications in the last 2 years I read where students talked about the difficulty they experienced in remote learning and the feelings of isolation and mental health issues that they were presented with. If you don't want to talk about it in your major essay, there's the additional information portion in the Common App, which is a wonderful place to talk about something like that. Let's say you saw a significant dip in your grades during that remote learning time. That's an area to talk about it. Let's say you do have an IEP and you have some learning issues. That's a good area to also talk about it. Using that additional information section to just give further insight into the student is really a valuable tool.
Another parent asked the difference between early action, early decision, and regular decision. We talked about this last time, but it's really important. So can you talk a little bit about it again, Kristin?
Sure, absolutely. So early decision is a binding contract between the student and the university. Both the student, the guidance counselor, and the parent have to sign the contract that if the student gets into the school, they have to attend. Early action is just applying a little earlier than regular decision and finding out earlier. It's not a binding contract. You're not required to go to that school. In our last webinar, I talked a tremendous about how I'm a huge proponent on early decision. And I talked about the differences in percentage rates of getting in early decision at certain schools. So I really recommend if you have a chance to look back at that webinar, because we really went in depth back then about early decision and how it can be an incredibly valuable tool for certain students.
Carrie asks, if a child has an IEP or a 504, is that something that should be mentioned somewhere on the application? And then how do schools factor that into admissions, or do they not factor it in at all?
So, I mean, I would talk about it if it's something that your student feels is important to talk about. If they feel that that has really kind of helped define who they are, then I would talk about it. If it hasn't, I don't think there's a need to talk about it. And there's absolutely no discrimination taken of anyone who has a learning disability at all. What I would recommend is if your child does, you think your child does require support in college, so when you research colleges, look at the support programs that they have at the university, at their disability centers, and what kind of accommodations they make for students with disabilities.
Thank you. So Sibby asked, due to COVID and remote learning, my child found it challenging. It took a bit to get his rhythm going. Would grades from 9th and 10th grade matter a lot? or is it mostly test scores that matter?
Well, when I talked before about it's really important, an upwards trajectory is the most important thing. So let's say your student in the remote learning time, they didn't do as well. It wasn't really indicative of who they are or their performance. Now that we're back to in-person learning, I would hope to see an upwards trajectory, and that's a super positive. And a downward spiral is also not great. But if your child is now back in the classroom and doing well, that's going to be in their favor. Because I promise you, evaluators know how difficult it was with remote learning for students, and that's taken into consideration.
Thank you, Kristin. Marlorie asked, are there are there books or online testing like personality testing that you can use to gently help a child figure out their passions?
We actually have those tools here. We use a College Planner Pro, and in there are assessments that we can do, personality assessments that kind of help a child see what their personality leans towards. And we do those assessments all the time. Also, some just gently questioning to the student can help pull out things from the student that they may not have realized even about themselves.
Thank you. Laura asks, she basically wants to know how admissions view kids from Thomas Jefferson. So if the student is from TJ is not one of the top students and they mostly have A's and B's, will the student be viewed less because of the B's, or the fact that just the TJ is ranked the #1 school in the country, so a few B's are okay? How do you view TJ kids compared to other students?
I mean, TJ is, as you said, Anne, it is one of the best high schools in the country, and colleges definitely know that. And when I talked before about digging deeper into schools, that is definitely a school that is that universities accept more from because of the reputation and the learning that is done at that school.
Thank you. Sarah asks, are there topics that you should not write about on your essays? Her daughter's counselor said not to write about sports, and that seems odd to her.
That seems really odd to me. If sports are incredibly important to your daughter, if they help define who she is, if she can create a narrative of what she's learned through playing sports, absolutely talk about it. I don't understand why a guidance counselor would say that.
Layla asks, for recommendations from teachers, does it have to be a high school teacher, or can any teacher from the past write a recommendation?
So I would say that it is more valuable to get a recommendation from a teacher in junior year or sophomore year or senior year. I think those play a little bit more weight. And then if you are a STEM kid, seeing a recommendation from a teacher in a science or a math can have a little bit more weight. Having recommendations from middle school teachers or such, those aren't really very valuable.
Okay, thank you for that. Does the FAFSA or the CSS profile, planned family contribution, impact admission decisions?
So this is where you have to do some research. There are schools that are need blind. There are schools that are need aware. And you can find all that information out through whatever counselor you use, or you can even find it on the internet. A school like University of Virginia is need blind, which means that even if a child, I don't even look where the child checks if they're going to be applying for financial aid. That's not factored in at all into the admissions process. There are schools, though, my daughter attends one of them, where the school provides a tremendous amount of aid to the students. And so if a student says that they need aid, that is factored into their decision-making.
Thank you, Kristin. Do passions have to align with what the student wants to major in?
Absolutely not. No, I just want to see them engaged and interested in something, and it doesn't have to align.
Tamara asks, if a student's test score is at the lower end of the mid 50th percentile range, should it still be submitted? Are these ranges trending higher because schools going test optional only really, really qualified students are submitting test scores?
I think you are seeing, because people are submitting scores only if they're really good, that you are seeing an uptick. Again, I would research I would look at the universities, the acceptance rates and where those scores were. And if your student isn't falling in the upper range of that, to me, that's more than 50%. I'm saying if they're not in the 75, they're not in the top 25%, at least, I wouldn't submit it.
Okay, thank you, Kristin. That's helpful. And our last question is, does a recommendation have to be from a core subject teacher?
It doesn't have to be from a core subject teacher, but it should be from some sort of substantive class.
Okay, thank you for that. One thing we didn't talk about tonight is AP scores and whether they should be submitted. Well, it's not, let me come back to this last question. But can you talk a little bit about the role of AP test scores right now?
Sure, absolutely. So a lot of people don't realize that you don't have to submit all of your AP scores. If your student got a 2 on the AP Spanish exam and they got a 5 on the AP Bio exam, you by all means submit the AP Bio 5. You do not have to submit the AP Spanish 2. And I would recommend that you don't submit the AP Spanish 2. Because of the pandemic, there were lots of instances where students weren't taking AP exams because of availability or for a whole host of reasons. And so when I was reviewing applications, if a student didn't take the AP exam, I didn't hold that against them. If they got an A in the class and they didn't take the exam, that A is worth a lot more than whatever that AP score would have been.
Thank you, Kristin.
Mm-hmm.
And Heather wants to know, should scores be submitted if my son has almost a perfect score in reading? I think she's probably talking about the SAT. And a poor score in the math. Should they submit? What should she submit? When submitting scores, are the sub scores looked at or the final combined score?
So almost all universities do what's called super score, which means they take the top, whatever, if your student took it 3 times, they take the top verbal and the top math, and they combine that, and that makes the super score. And so that's what they look at. Again, for this specific question, I would combine, if this is the only time they've taken the test and they won't take it again, I would combine those 2 scores. And at the schools that your student wants to apply to, see where that would fall. And again, if it's not in that upper range, I wouldn't submit it.
Thanks, Kristin. Last question, I promise. When you apply early decision and you're accepted, does your acceptance get pulled immediately, or does it roll over to early action if you're not accepted?
Depends on the school. There are some schools, if you apply early decision, it's one and done, and you're done. That's the end for that school. There are other schools where you can be deferred from the early decision process, and that will roll over into the early action or the regular decision. So very, very important to research the early decision process at the universities at the university that your student is interested in applying early decision to.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Kristin. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. I hope you found this to be helpful. It was a pleasure to see all of you tonight. If we can be of help, feel free to reach out at any time. I wish you all the best for the summer months and for a very successful school year next year. Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening. And don't forget to wait for the survey at the end. Bye-bye.